The final click of the apartment door's lock sounded like a gunshot in the unnervingly quiet hallway. It was a sound of absolute finality, a metallic punctuation mark at the end of a life she no longer had. Elena felt the cold, smooth metal of the key as she pushed it back under the door, a final act of surrender. Her hand trembled, not from the chill in the airless corridor, but from a deep, bone-rattling exhaustion. A wave of nausea rose in her throat as she thought of the landlord's pitiless eyes, the smug satisfaction as he watched them drag their single, battered suitcase and the heavy case containing her old sewing machine across the threshold. She could feel the stares of her neighbors through their peepholes, a mixture of pity and relief that it wasn't them. Taking a shaky breath that did nothing to calm her, she felt her heart thumping a slow, painful rhythm against her ribs. Each beat was a reminder of her failure. She turned to her son, Lucas, who stood beside her, his 16-year-old shoulders slumped under the weight of a backpack and a world he was too young to carry. Huddled on a splintery bench at a forgotten bus stop, the city's indifferent roar washing over them, Elena's trembling fingers unfolded the last of their world, 3 crisp $100 bills. The paper felt fragile, almost weightless, a cruel joke for something that was supposed to represent security. She counted the change in her palm, the clink of the coins, a pathetic sound against the screech of distant traffic. The sum was a mockery of the mountain of medical debt her husband's sudden death had left behind, an avalanche that had swiftly buried them. A sharp, gnawing pain twisted in her stomach, the familiar ache of hunger she had been ignoring for 2 days to ensure Lucas could eat. She felt a burning shame, counting their meager funds out in the open, her movements furtive as if she were committing a crime. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, hot and threatening, but she forced them back. Crying was a luxury she couldn't afford. A deep, hollow coldness settled in her chest, a void left by grief that was now being filled with the icy tendrils of pure, undiluted panic. The scent of diesel exhaust from a passing truck filled her lungs, and for a fleeting, terrible moment, it smelled like the sterile, chemical odor of the hospital. The memory ambushed her, a fresh wave of grief so cold and sharp it pierced through the numbness and stole her breath. She saw her husband's face, pale against the white pillow, his hand limp in hers. He was gone. The thought was still impossible. A jagged piece of glass lodged in her mind. Now, his absence was a physical presence, a heavy cloak she couldn't shrug off. She felt the crushing weight of being the only pillar left standing for their son, and she could feel herself beginning to crumble. Her love for Lucas was a fierce, desperate thing, but love couldn't buy food or pay for a room. It couldn't shield him from the cold wind that whipped around the corner, or from the harsh reality reflected in his young, worried eyes. She felt a profound sense of isolation, as if she and her son were on a tiny, crumbling raft, adrift on an endless, hostile ocean with no land in sight. Lucas hadn't spoken more than a few words all day. He just stared at his worn-out sneakers, the toe of one scuffed through to the grey sock underneath. He kicked at a loose piece of gravel on the pavement, the small, repetitive sound grating on Elena's raw nerves. His silence was louder than any accusation. He was trying so hard to be the man of the house, to be strong for her, and that manufactured bravery broke her heart more than any outburst of tears or anger ever could. She reached out and placed a hand on his arm, the fabric of his thin jacket rough beneath her palm. He didn't flinch, but he didn't look at her either. In the reflection of the bus shelter's grimy plexiglass, she saw them, a ghost of a woman and a boy pretending to be a man, 2 displaced figures against a backdrop of urban decay. A profound sense of failure washed over her. She had failed to protect him, failed to provide even the most basic security. The world had chewed them up and spit them out onto this desolate street corner, and she had no idea what to do next. Her fingers found the single, crinkled piece of paper in her coat pocket. It felt thin and fragile, like their chances. She pulled it out, the lawyer's letter she had read a dozen times. The words swam before her eyes. But one phrase stood out: Klaus's print shop. The only asset left, a long-abandoned commercial property her husband had inherited from a grandfather he never knew and had never once mentioned. It wasn't a lifeline. It was a single, frayed thread dangling over a chasm. The name sounded foreign, distant, holding no warmth, No promise of home. It was just a place, but it was their only place. The thought of it, a derelict building in some forgotten industrial zone, sent a shiver of dread down her spine. But the alternative, the street, a shelter, or something worse, was unthinkable. A grim resolve hardened in her gut. It wasn't hope that made her stand up, but the utter absence of any other choice. "Come on," she said, her voice raspy. "We have a place to go." The heavy oak door of the lawyer's office clicked shut behind them, the sound unnervingly soft and final. It sealed them out of that world of quiet wealth and back into the loud, chaotic reality of the street. Elena felt the warmth of the building being instantly stripped away by the raw city wind. She looked down at the single, old-fashioned brass key in her palm. It was surprisingly heavy. Beside it was a slip of paper with an address scrawled on it, a series of numbers and a street name that meant nothing to her. The address felt like a lottery ticket, a random combination that held the power to either save them or confirm their complete and utter ruin. Lucas stood beside her, his eyes wide, trying to read her expression for the first time all day. He saw the flicker of manufactured hope in her eyes, and his own shoulders straightened just a bit. "Is it a house, Mom?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. She forced a smile, the muscles in her face feeling stiff and unused. "It's a property, sweetie." A start. The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. She clutched the key, its jagged edges digging into her palm. The bus ride was a slow, rattling descent into a part of the city she never knew existed. It rumbled away from the familiar avenues, its groaning engine a mournful soundtrack to their exodus. Elena watched the landscape transform through the grimy window. Gleaming skyscrapers gave way to squat apartment blocks, then to rows of identical houses with postage-stamp lawns, and finally the city began to fray at the edges. The neat grid of streets dissolved into a tangle of service roads and forgotten thoroughfares. The other passengers thinned out, replaced by weary-looking workers in stained uniforms until it was just her, Lucas, and a man smelling of stale beer asleep in the back. The air inside the bus grew heavy with the smell of diesel and despair. Each lurch and squeal of the brakes seemed to pull them further from the light, deeper into the urban wasteland. An industrial park began to unfold outside, a graveyard of rusted metal and crumbling brick. A knot of dread tightened in Elena's stomach. This couldn't be it. This couldn't be their salvation. The bus driver called out their stop, his voice flat and bored. "Industrial zone, last one," he grunted, not even turning around. The hiss of the hydraulic doors opening sounded like a sigh of resignation. They stepped out into a world of monochrome grey. The sky was a uniform, overcast sheet, and the ground was a patchwork of cracked asphalt and pale, stubborn weeds. The first thing that struck her was the silence. The constant hum of the city was gone, replaced by a low, mournful whistle of wind threading its way through derelict buildings. A rusted chain-link fence, topped with curls of barbed wire, lined one side of the road. On the other stood a row of hulking, windowless warehouses, their corrugated metal walls streaked with rust like dried blood. The air was cold and carried a strange, metallic scent mixed with the smell of damp decay. Elena felt a primal urge to turn back, to grab Lucas and run, but there was nothing to run back to. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird in her chest. This was a terrible mistake. They walked for what felt like miles, their footsteps echoing unnervingly in the oppressive silence. The address on the envelope led them down a side street that was little more than a potholed alley. The buildings here were even more skeletal, some with roofs caved in, their dark interiors exposed to the elements like gaping mouths. Lucas walked close beside her, his earlier flicker of excitement completely extinguished, replaced by a tense, watchful quiet. Elena could feel his fear, a cold radiation that seemed to emanate from his small frame, and it fed her own growing panic. She pulled her thin coat tighter, but the chill she felt was deep inside, a coldness of the soul. This was not a place for the living. It was a boneyard of industry, a place where dreams came to die. A single, tattered plastic bag caught on a fence danced in the wind, a lonely, frantic ghost. The sight made a lump form in her throat. She felt just as lost, just as empty, tossed about by forces she couldn't control. The street number was on a peeling sign just ahead, and there it was, Klaus's print shop. The letters were painted in a grand curling script, but the paint had flaked away, leaving only ghostly outlines on the weathered brick facade. It was a two-story building, squat and grim, wedged between a warehouse that had been gutted by fire and another with gaping holes in its walls. The large storefront window on the ground floor was covered with thick, splintering plywood. Above, the second-story windows were dark, vacant eyes, one of them shattered, a jagged black hole staring down at them. The hope she had so carefully nurtured, that fragile, desperate little flame, was instantly snuffed out, plunged into an ocean of despair. This was not a new start. It was a tomb. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she had to put a hand against the cold, rough brick to steady herself. Her stomach churned violently. This was a cruel joke. The universe was laughing at her, a cold, humorless sound that echoed in the desolate street. And she finally understood the lawyer's hurried tone, his averted eyes. Lucas just stared, his mouth slightly agape. He looked from the building to his mother, his eyes asking a question she had no answer for. "This is it," he whispered, his voice small and lost. Elena couldn't speak. She could only nod, the movement feeling jerky and unnatural. She felt his trust in her, the bedrock of his entire world, cracking beneath his feet. She was supposed to fix this, to make it better, and instead, she had led him to this monument to failure. The shame was a physical thing, a hot flush that spread up her neck and across her face. She felt like a fraud, a con artist who had sold her own son a bill of goods. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the cold, damp air filling her lungs and doing nothing to calm the frantic beating of her heart. The key in her pocket now felt like a lead weight, dragging her down. It was the key to their prison, not their salvation. She had to force her feet to move, to walk the last few steps to the recessed doorway, each step an act of immense, soul-crushing effort. The door was set back in a small alcove, shrouded in shadow. A thick, rusted chain was looped through the handles, secured by an ancient, heavy-duty padlock. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought they were locked out, that this final, pathetic shelter would be denied to them. Then she remembered the heavy brass key. Her fingers, numb with cold and anxiety, fumbled to fit it into the lock. The metal was icy against her skin. She jammed it into the keyhole, the grating sound of metal on rusted metal setting her teeth on edge. It took all her strength to turn it. The lock sprang open with a loud, sudden clack that echoed in the alcove. The sound was so abrupt, so violent, it made her jump. Lucas flinched beside her. Unwinding the heavy, cold chain felt like unleashing some long, slumbering beast. The chain links were coarse and left a film of rust and grease on her hands. Now, only the door stood between them and the unknown darkness within. She felt a profound reluctance to cross the threshold, a deep animal instinct screaming that this place was wrong. She put her shoulder to the door and pushed. It didn't budge. It was swollen in its frame, sealed shut by years of damp and neglect. A low, desperate sound escaped her throat. She pushed again, grunting with the effort, her feet slipping on the grimy concrete. "Let me try," Lucas said, his voice surprisingly firm. He wedged his shoulder next to hers, and they pushed together. For a moment, nothing. Then, with a deep, groaning shriek of tortured wood, the door scraped open just enough for them to squeeze through. The first thing that hit her was the smell. It was a physical assault, a thick, gagging wave of cold, stagnant air. It was the smell of a forgotten basement, of wet earth and pervasive mold, but layered with something else. A faint, sharp, chemical odor that pricked at the back of her throat. The smell of ink and solvents, ghosts of the work that had stopped decades ago. It was the smell of decay, the smell of a place that hadn't seen sunlight or fresh air in a lifetime. A profound sense of dread washed over her, chilling her to the bone. The darkness inside was almost absolute. The light from the partially open door did little to penetrate the gloom, illuminating only a small patch of debris-strewn floor. As her eyes slowly adjusted, shapes began to emerge from the shadows, monstrous and immense. They were printing presses, giant, hulking machines of cast iron dominating the space like sleeping leviathans. They were covered in thick blankets of dust and cobwebs that hung like funeral shrouds. The sheer scale of them was intimidating, filling the vast room and leaving only narrow pathways between them. A constant, rhythmic plink, plink, plink echoed from somewhere deep within the cavernous space. It was the sound of water, a leak. The sound was maddening, a slow, steady metronome counting down their descent into utter hopelessness. Elena felt her lungs tighten. The air was so heavy and cold it was difficult to breathe. This wasn't a home, it wasn't even a shelter. It was a cold, wet, iron-filled cave, a place where hope came to be buried. Lucas fumbled in his backpack and pulled out a small keychain flashlight. The weak beam cut a shaky circle through the oppressive darkness, dancing over the scene and revealing the full extent of the ruin. The light slid across the floor, showing wide, dark patches of dampness and puddles of stagnant water. It climbed one of the iron giants, revealing intricate gears and levers, all frozen under a patina of rust. Then he pointed it upwards. Elena's breath hitched in her throat. The ceiling was a nightmare. Huge sections of plaster had fallen away, exposing the dark, rotting lathes underneath. In one corner, a massive hole gaped open to the grey sky, and it was from here that the water was dripping. A relentless trickle of rain and misery. Chunks of ceiling littered the floor like fallen tombstones. The entire structure felt unstable, dangerous. She felt a fresh wave of nausea. The landlord's smug face flashed in her mind. He had evicted them from a safe, warm apartment for this. The injustice of it was a bitter pill in her throat. The beam of light found a small, partitioned-off area in the back corner. An office, perhaps. Lucas walked slowly towards it, his footsteps splashing softly in the unseen puddles. Elena followed, her body moving on autopilot, her mind numb with shock. Inside the small room was a desk, its surface warped and swollen from the damp. A chair lay on its side, one of its legs broken. Sodden, mold-blackened papers were fused to the floor in a pulpy mass. This was where Klaus, her husband's grandfather, had worked. She tried to imagine him here, surrounded by the roar of the presses, the smell of fresh ink, but the image wouldn't form. All she could sense was the profound, suffocating weight of time and neglect. She ran a hand over the damp, crumbling wall, and her fingers came away wet and gritty. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran down her spine. The feeling of being watched, of being in a place where a great sadness had occurred, was overwhelming. This place wasn't just empty. It was haunted by absence and the slow, grinding victory of decay. "Mom," Lucas's voice was barely a whisper. He was standing in the center of the main room, his small light tracing the outline of a fallen ceiling beam that lay across one of the narrow walkways. "We can't stay here. It's not safe." He was right. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, to take him and run. But where? The question hammered at her, a merciless refrain. Where would they go? Back to the bus stop, to a homeless shelter where they would be separated. The $300 in her coat pocket felt like monopoly money, useless against the sheer, crushing reality of their situation. The false hope had been a mirage in the desert, and now, having reached it, she found only more sand, more desolation. This was worse than the street. On the street, there was at least the sky, the illusion of openness. Here, she felt buried alive. The massive iron presses seemed to lean in, the walls seemed to be closing, the dripping water, a cruel mockery of a ticking clock. Panic began to claw its way up her throat, hot and suffocating. She sank down onto the edge of a large, overturned wooden crate, her legs refusing to support her any longer. The wood was cold and damp, seeping through the thin fabric of her coat. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to fight back a tremor that started in her hands and spread through her entire body. It was a tremor of cold, of hunger, of pure, abject terror. Tears she had held back for days finally broke free. They weren't loud, racking sobs, but silent, hot tears that streamed down her face, tracing paths through the grime of the city. They were tears of failure, of grief, of a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical weight crushing her chest. She had promised her husband, in the silent, sterile hospital room, that she would take care of their son, and this was her promise kept. A collapsing, mold-infested ruin in the middle of nowhere. The despair was a physical entity, a black, viscous liquid filling her lungs, drowning her from the inside out. This was it. This was the bottom. There was nowhere left to fall. Lucas came over and knelt in front of her, his face a pale oval in the gloom. He didn't say anything. He just reached out and put his hand on her knee, a small, warm pressure in the overwhelming cold. The simple gesture of comfort, of solidarity from her child who she was supposed to be protecting, shattered the last of her composure. A raw, guttural sob escaped her lips. She had tried so hard to be strong for him, to shield him from the depths of her fear, but the mask was gone. He saw it all now. He saw the broken woman she had become. The dripping water continued its steady, indifferent rhythm. Plink, plink, plink. The sound seemed to be inside her head, a maddening, inescapable beat. The cold of the place seeped into her bones, a deep, invasive chill that promised sickness and misery. Her last flicker of fight was gone, extinguished by the relentless damp and darkness. She looked around at the iron skeletons and the rubble, and for the first time in her life, Elena felt the complete and utter absence of hope. She was defeated. The final remnants of daylight faded from the shattered window and the gaping hole in the roof, plunging the print shop into a profound and chilling darkness. Lucas's small flashlight beam was now their only star in a universe of black, its weak circle of light seeming to shrink, pushed back by the encroaching shadows. The cold intensified, biting at any exposed skin. Elena could hear the faint chattering of Lucas's teeth. The hunger in her own stomach was now a sharp, twisting pain, no longer a dull ache. She felt a wave of light-headedness, the world tilting slightly on its axis. Every sound was magnified in the dark, the relentless dripping, the moan of the wind outside, the scuttling sound of a rat in a far corner that made her flinch violently. She pulled Lucas closer, his thin body trembling against hers. This wasn't shelter. It was a trap. They had traded one form of homelessness for another, far more dangerous version. She was a captain who had steered her ship directly onto the rocks, and now she and her only crewman were sinking in the dark. Dawn did not break. It seeped. A weak, grey light filtered through the grimy, shattered window and the hole in the roof, diluting the blackness into a murky, depressing gloom. The cold had settled deep into Elena's bones, an ache that felt permanent. She had barely slept, huddled with Lucas on a pile of dusty tarps, listening to the drip, drip, drip of the water and the scuttling of unseen creatures. A profound ache radiated from her empty stomach, and her head throbbed with a dull, persistent pain. She looked at Lucas, asleep beside her, his face pale and smudged with dirt. His youthful features were tight with worry even in sleep. A surge of fierce, protective energy, born not of hope but of sheer animal instinct, pulsed through her veins. She could not let him wake up to this same despair. They could not simply lie here and rot. She felt a new resolve harden in her chest, as cold and unyielding as the iron presses that surrounded them. Action, any action, was better than this crushing paralysis. She would not be defeated. Not yet. She had to create order in the chaos, even a tiny corner of it. She gently untangled herself from her sleeping son, her movements slow and stiff. Her joints protested with sharp pops and creaks that sounded deafeningly loud in the cavernous silence. Standing up, she surveyed their prison in the dim morning light. The scene was even more disheartening than it had been in the dark. The scale of the decay was overwhelming. Piles of rubble, fallen plaster, and sodden, unrecognizable debris littered the floor. The giant machines, coated in a thick, velvety layer of dust, seemed like ancient, forgotten gods of a dead religion. The air was thick with the smell of mold and damp, a smell that clung to the back of her throat and made her feel perpetually nauseous. Her heart sank, the resolve from moments before wavering in the face of the monumental task ahead. Where could they even begin? It felt like trying to empty the ocean with a thimble. A wave of exhaustion washed over her, so potent it made her knees feel weak. She felt a familiar sting behind her eyes, the threat of tears, but she blinked it back fiercely. Her gaze settled on a small section against the far wall, a space slightly less cluttered than the rest. It was a 10 by 10-foot area, boxed in by a wall and two of the smaller, less intimidating presses. If she could just clear that one small patch, they could lay their tarps on the bare concrete. They could have a designated spot, a place that was theirs, a tiny island of relative order in this sea of ruin. It was a pathetic goal, but it was tangible. It was something she could do. Clutching at this small sliver of purpose, Elena felt her focus narrow. The rest of the dilapidated shop faded into the periphery. Only that small square mattered. She found a splintered piece of a wooden pallet that could serve as a makeshift broom and a rusted snow shovel with a broken handle. The tools were pitiful, but they were better than her bare hands. Lucas began to stir, and she called to him, her voice hoarse but firm. "Lucas, get up. We're clearing a space." She needed him to see her fighting, to believe that they were not just victims of their fate. The main obstacle blocking her chosen corner was not debris, but the monolithic flank of an enormous, antique printing press. It was a Heidelberg, according to a tarnished brass plate affixed to its side, a name that meant nothing to her but sounded powerful and German. The machine was a mechanical beast, a labyrinth of black iron gears, levers, and rollers, all silent and frozen. It was bigger than a car, a solid mass of industrial-era engineering that seemed fused to the very foundations of the building. She pushed against it with all her might, her hands flat against the cold, dusty metal. It didn't move. It didn't even shudder. It was as immovable as a mountain. A feeling of helpless frustration surged through her. Her plan, her tiny grasp at control, was thwarted by this silent, iron behemoth. She kicked its base, a foolish act of anger that sent a painful jolt up her leg, but left the machine utterly indifferent. Her breath came in ragged gasps, a mixture of exertion and rising panic. She could not fail at this. Not this first, small thing. Lucas, now fully awake and seeing her struggle, came to her side. His face was a mask of weary concern. "It's too heavy, Mom," he said, his voice flat. He was right, but she couldn't accept it. She circled the machine, her eyes scanning its complex form, hoping for some lever or wheel that might release a brake. The design was seamless, a monument to purpose-built function, with no obvious weaknesses. It was Lucas who saw it first. He was running his hand along a large side panel, his fingers tracing the patterns in the thick dust. "Mom, look at this," he said, his voice laced with a new note of curiosity. He pointed to a thick, crude line of welding that ran down the length of a heavy iron plate near the machine's base. It was ugly and uneven, completely out of place with the precise, elegant engineering of the rest of the press. The metal around the seam was discolored, bubbled, and scorched from intense heat. It was clearly a modification, a clumsy scar on an otherwise perfectly crafted body. It was wrong. Her heart gave a strange, sudden thump. A flicker of something, not hope, but intense curiosity, ignited within her. Why would someone crudely weld a panel onto a machine like this? It made no sense from a mechanical standpoint. It was a patch, a seal. It was hiding something. She knelt, her knees pressing into the cold, gritty concrete, and ran her own fingers over the rough, raised line of metal. It was sharp and jagged in places, a stark contrast to the smooth cast iron surrounding it. Her pulse quickened. The dripping water, the cold, the hunger, it all faded into the background. This one anomaly, this single point of imperfection in the vast, decaying room, commanded her complete attention. She pressed on the panel. It was solid, unmoving. She knocked on it with her knuckles. The sound was a dull, heavy thud, different from the resonant clang of the main frame. It sounded thicker, denser, less hollow. A shiver, completely unrelated to the cold, traveled up her spine. This was not part of the machine. It was an addition, a secret. "We need to get this off," she whispered, more to herself than to Lucas. Her mind raced. The only tool they had with any real leverage was a long, heavy crowbar they had found near the loading bay door, its end rusted to a dull point. Lucas, sensing the shift in her energy, ran to get it. He returned, dragging the heavy iron bar, the sound of it scraping along the concrete echoing through the silent shop. The crowbar felt heavy and powerful in her hands, a tool of creation and destruction. It felt like an extension of her own desperate will. She wedged the pointed end into a tiny gap where the clumsy weld met the original frame of the press. She put her weight on it, grunting with the effort. The bar bowed slightly, but the weld held. A low groan of protesting metal was the only response. The sound seemed to wake the sleeping giant, a noise from its long, dead throat. A surge of adrenaline shot through her, sharpening her senses. She felt a primal, obsessive need to see what was behind this metal plate. Lucas crouched beside her, his flashlight beam fixed on the point where the crowbar met the iron. "Try here, Mom," he suggested, pointing to a spot where the weld looked thinner, more brittle. She repositioned the bar, jamming it into the new spot with a sharp metallic scrape. She took a deep breath. The cold, chemical-tinged air filling her lungs, and threw all her weight, all her frustration, all her grief into the effort. There was a loud, sharp crack, like a rifle shot. The sound was so violent it made them both cry out. A hairline fracture appeared in the weld. It was working. A wild, almost manic energy seized her. She worked the crowbar back and forth, widening the crack. Shards of rusted metal flaked away. The sound was a screeching, tearing symphony of destruction, an assault on the tomb-like silence of the building. Her muscles screamed in protest, her hands were raw, but she didn't stop. With each heave on the bar, the gap widened, revealing a sliver of profound, absolute darkness within. It was happening. With one final, desperate heave, the weld gave way entirely. The heavy iron panel, freed from its prison of rust and solder, tore loose with a deafening shriek of metal. It fell outwards and crashed onto the concrete floor with a thunderous clang that reverberated through the entire building, sending up a cloud of dust and rust particles that swirled in the flashlight beam like angry spirits. For a moment, they just stared, their ears ringing, their hearts pounding in their chests. The air was suddenly thick with a new smell, not of mold or chemicals, but of something else. It was a dry, close scent, the smell of trapped air, of old oilcloth, and something else, something fainter, the dusty, metallic scent of cold, old gold. Elena's breath hitched in her throat. Her body was trembling, not from cold or exhaustion, but from a terrifying, electric anticipation. She slowly approached the gaping black hole in the side of the machine, her hand shaking so badly she could barely hold it steady. Lucas held the flashlight beam on the opening, his own breathing shallow. The cavity was not large, perhaps 2 feet wide and 3 feet deep, a man-made hollow carved into the dense iron heart of the machine. It was a secret safe, hidden in plain sight, and it was not empty. Lucas directed the trembling beam of light inside, and Elena's eyes widened. The space was tightly packed with objects wrapped in dark, oiled canvas, tied securely with thick twine. There were about a dozen of them, all different sizes, some small and square, others longer and rectangular. They were dark, silent shapes, their contents a complete mystery. Elena felt a dizzying mix of fear and elation. This was it. This was the secret. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might break. She reached a trembling hand into the cold, dark opening. Her fingers brushed against the rough, waxy texture of the oilcloth. It was cool and slightly stiff with age. She gripped the twine of the nearest bundle. It was heavier than she expected. Much heavier. It took both hands to lift it out of the compartment. She placed the first bundle on the floor, the heavy thud of it startlingly loud. It was a small, rectangular package, but it felt like it was filled with lead. Lucas kept the flashlight beam trained on it as she worked at the knotted twine with numb, clumsy fingers. The knot was tight, sealed by time and pressure. She fumbled in her pocket and found a small, dull pocket knife her husband had carried. Its edge barely sharp enough to saw through the thick string. The twine snapped, and she carefully unfolded the stiff, cracking layers of oilcloth. Inside, the first layer of protection gave way to a second, a simple, heavy-duty canvas bag, its mouth tied shut with a leather thong. The bag was a faded, nondescript tan color, stained with age, but the weight of it was undeniable. She could feel hard, disc-shaped objects shifting inside. A wave of nausea and lightheadedness washed over her. Her mind refused to make the leap, to believe what her senses were telling her. It was impossible. It was a dream. She fumbled with the leather thong, her fingers shaking uncontrollably. It finally came loose, and she tilted the mouth of the bag downwards. The first thing that emerged was not a coin, but a small, hand-cast bar of gold. It was dull in the weak light, heavy and unassuming. It slid from the bag and landed in the palm of her hand with a solid, satisfying weight. It was cool to the touch, its surface slightly rough. She stared at it, her mind a complete blank. It was real. She could feel its density, see the faint, unique marks of its crude casting. Then she tilted the bag again. A cascade of gold coins spilled out onto the dusty concrete floor, fanning out in a pool of breathtaking light. They weren't shiny like movie treasure. They were old, with a deep, soft luster, catching the weak flashlight beam and throwing it back with a warm, buttery glow. The sound they made, a soft, musical clatter, was the most beautiful and terrifying sound she had ever heard. It was the sound of a life-changing, world-shattering secret. Lucas let out a choked gasp, his hand flying to his mouth. He dropped to his knees beside the spreading pool of gold, his eyes wide with utter disbelief. He reached out a hesitant finger and touched one of the coins, snatching his hand back as if it were hot. Elena just stared, her entire body numb. The sight was too much to process. It felt like a hallucination brought on by hunger and despair. She picked up one of the coins. It was heavy in her palm, the face of a long-forgotten European monarch staring up at her. Her mind struggled to comprehend the scale of it. There were dozens of coins in this one bag alone, and there were more bags and more bars. This wasn't just a few pieces of jewelry. This was a fortune, a life-altering, dangerous fortune. A profound sense of vertigo swept over her, and she had to place a hand on the cold iron of the press to steady herself. The world had just tilted on its axis, and she didn't know which way was up. This much money. It wasn't a solution. It was a new, infinitely more complicated problem. Driven by a feverish energy, she and Lucas pulled the remaining bundles from the hidden compartment. Each one was as heavy as the first. One by one, they opened the canvas bags, their contents spilling out to join the growing hoard on the floor. More coins, from different countries and different eras. More of the small, hand-cast gold bars. The pile grew into a small mountain of wealth. A dragon's hoard discovered in the belly of an iron beast. The sheer, dumbfounding reality of it was staggering. It was more money than she had ever seen, more than she could even imagine. The initial shock began to recede, replaced by 1,000 frantic questions. Whose was it? Why was it here? Was it stolen? The thought sent a jolt of ice-cold fear through her. If this was stolen money, they hadn't found salvation. They had found a death sentence. Suddenly, the gold on the floor seemed less like a miracle and more like a trap, a glittering lure laid by a predator they couldn't see. A terrible, crushing weight settled on her shoulders. It was as she was pulling out the very last, lightest package that she felt something different. Tucked into the far back corner of the compartment, almost hidden behind the space where the last bag had been, was another object. It wasn't wrapped in oilcloth. It was a book, a leather-bound ledger, about the size of a shoebox, its dark brown cover smooth and cool to the touch. It was old, the leather worn at the corners, but it was in remarkably good condition, preserved by the sealed, dry environment. It felt different from the gold. The gold was a raw, primal fact, but this felt like a story. It felt like an answer. Her hands trembled as she lifted it out. It was surprisingly light compared to the bags of gold, but it felt infinitely heavier, burdened with the weight of unspoken secrets. She ran her thumb over the unadorned cover. There was no title, no markings of any kind. This was the key. She knew it with a certainty that chilled her to the bone. The gold was the what. This book was the why. She sat back on her heels, the ledger resting in her lap. Lucas had stopped looking at the gold and was now staring at the book, his expression a mixture of awe and trepidation. The air in the print shop felt charged, electric. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with anticipation. Elena slowly, reverently, opened the cover. The first page was blank, yellowed with age. The second page, however, was filled with script. It was not English. The handwriting was neat, precise, and distinctly European, written in a disciplined, slightly slanted hand. It was German. Elena couldn't read the language, but she could recognize it. Her heart pounded a slow, heavy rhythm. Below the first paragraph of text were names, a list of names, followed by columns of numbers and descriptions. The ink was a faded sepia, but it was perfectly legible. She could make out names that sounded German, Polish, Austrian, names like Stern, Abramovich, Weiss. Beside each name was a series of numbers, meticulously recorded. Even without understanding the words, she understood the purpose of the document in her hands. This was an accounting, a record. The names, the numbers, they corresponded to the treasure laid out on the floor before them. A cold dread mixed with profound awe washed over her. This wasn't a robber's loot. It was something else entirely. It was a collection, a trust. Each coin, each bar, belonged to one of these names. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She felt the weight of dozens of lives, of stories she couldn't read, settling upon her. This secret was not theirs to keep. It was a sacred duty that had fallen into their laps. She looked from the names in the book to the pile of gold, and then to her son's wide, frightened eyes. The despair of their poverty was gone, but it had been replaced by a fear that was far deeper and more complex. They had stumbled out of one crisis and into the heart of a history they did not understand, a history that was very much alive and, she suspected, very, very dangerous. The initial euphoria of the discovery had completely evaporated, replaced by the chilling weight of responsibility. The gold was no longer a glittering promise of a new life. It was evidence. It was a burden. Each coin felt like a soul. Each bar a condensed life story. Who were these people? What happened to them? Why was their treasure hidden inside a printing press in a derelict corner of the city? The questions swirled in Elena's mind. A dizzying vortex of confusion and fear. She was just a seamstress, a widow trying to keep her son safe. She was not equipped for this. She felt an overwhelming urge to put it all back, to close the panel, and to pretend they had never found it, to take a handful of coins, just enough to get by and leave the rest. But she knew she couldn't. The moment she saw the names in the ledger, the moment she understood it was a record of trust, that option had vanished. She was inextricably tied to this secret now, a guardian by accident. The thought was terrifying. She felt trapped, not by poverty anymore, but by a treasure she couldn't keep and a secret she couldn't ignore. Lucas seemed to sense the shift in her mood. He moved closer, his shoulder pressing against hers, a silent gesture of support. "What is it, Mum? What does it say?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She could only shake her head, tracing a name in the ledger with her finger. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion, "but it's not ours." The words hung in the air between them, solidifying the new reality of their situation. The gold, which minutes before had represented a fantastical escape, now felt like a cage. It was a dangerous truth lying exposed on their dirty floor. They couldn't spend it. They couldn't report it without being accused of theft. They were squatting in a derelict building with a fortune in undocumented gold and a ledger that was likely the only proof of its true ownership. A new kind of panic began to set in, colder and more rational than her earlier despair. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about justice, history, and the kind of powerful, dangerous people who might be willing to kill for a secret like this. She carefully closed the ledger, the soft thud of the cover seeming to seal their fate. The immediate problem was what to do with it all. They couldn't leave a mountain of gold sitting on the floor. With a sense of urgency, she and Lucas began the painstaking process of putting the treasure back into the canvas bags. The musical clink of the coins now sounded like an alarm, each one a potential piece of evidence against them. Her hands, which had trembled with excitement before, now shook with fear. Every sound from outside, the wind whistling through a broken window, the distant rumble of a truck, made her jump. She felt exposed, vulnerable. The secret felt like a living thing, a beacon in the dark that was calling out to anyone who might be looking for it. They worked in silence, The only sounds the soft chink of gold and their own ragged breathing. The joy of the discovery was a distant memory, a brief, manic moment before the crushing reality of their situation had crashed down upon them. They were no longer just poor and homeless. They were in danger. Once the gold was back in the bags, a new problem arose. The broken panel. They couldn't leave the gaping hole in the side of the machine. It was a blatant advertisement of the secret it had held. Elena looked at the heavy, bent iron plate lying on the floor. It was too heavy to lift back into place, and the weld was destroyed. Her mind raced, searching for a solution. They needed to hide it. But how? The shop was full of junk, but nothing large enough to convincingly cover the opening without drawing attention. Lucas, ever practical, pointed towards a stack of old, greasy tarpaulins in the corner. "We could drape those over the side," he suggested. "Make it look like it's just covered to protect it from the leaks." It was a flimsy solution, but it was the best they had. They dragged the heavy, dusty tarps over, draping them carefully over the entire side of the Heidelberg press, making sure the cloth hung all the way to the floor, concealing the dark opening. It wasn't perfect, but in the gloom of the shop, it might be enough to deflect a casual glance. With the gold re-hidden and the evidence of their discovery concealed, a tense, watchful silence fell over them again. Eleanor tucked the precious ledger inside her coat, the hard corners of the book pressing against her ribs. It felt both like a shield and a target. The adrenaline that had fueled her for the last hour began to fade, leaving behind a deep, profound weariness and a gnawing dread. She looked around the grim print shop, at the decay and the shadows. The place was no longer just a ruin. It was a mausoleum. It was the tomb of Klaus, her husband's unknown grandfather, and the tomb of his incredible secret. She now understood the strange feeling she'd had upon entering, the sense of a story waiting to be told. She had found the story, and now its weight was hers to carry. She had come here seeking shelter from a storm, only to find herself at the absolute epicenter of a hurricane she was just beginning to comprehend. The mystery had opened up before her, vast and terrifying. She sat on the cold floor, Lucas beside her, the weak flashlight beam making their shadows dance like giants on the wall. The hunger, the cold, the exhaustion, they were all still there, but they were now secondary concerns, pushed into the background by the sheer magnitude of what they had found. The gold was a physical presence, even hidden. She could feel its weight, its silent, powerful call. It was a promise and a threat, all at once. The drama of their poverty had been eclipsed by the mystery of this treasure. Who was Klaus? Was he a hero or a thief? Who were the people in the ledger, and what had become of them? And the most terrifying question of all, was anyone else looking for this? Had anyone else heard the rumors of a hidden fortune in an abandoned print shop? The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through her. The isolation that had felt like a curse now seemed like their only protection. Out here, in this forgotten boneyard of industry, they were alone with their terrible, glittering secret. She opened the ledger again, just for a moment, and stared at the list of names under the weak light. Stern, Abramovich, Weiss. They were not just words on a page. They were people, families. They had trusted a man named Klaus with everything they had in the world, and Klaus had hidden it, died, and left it to lie dormant for decades until she, a desperate widow at the end of her rope, had stumbled upon it. It felt like a sacred inheritance, a chain of trust that had been passed down through the generations, through death and silence, to land squarely in her trembling hands. The weight of it was immense. She felt a connection to this grandfather-in-law she had never known, a man who had engineered this incredible secret. She had to honor that trust. She had to find out what happened. The need for answers was a burning fire in her gut, overriding her fear. She had to understand the story contained within these pages. Her own story of survival had just become a footnote in a much larger, older, and more dangerous narrative. The first step was to try and translate the ledger. It was their only map in this new, terrifying landscape. She didn't speak German, but Lucas had taken 2 years of it in high school. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. "Lucas," she said, her voice quiet but intense, "I need you to look at this. Tell me anything you can understand." She handed him the book, and he took it carefully, his young face serious and focused. He angled the book towards the flashlight, his brow furrowed in concentration as he slowly scanned the elegant foreign script. He was quiet for a long time, the only sound the maddening, rhythmic dripping of water from the ceiling. Eleanor held her breath, watching his face, praying for a clue, a single word that could give them some bearing. The mystery of the gold was no longer just about its value. It was about its origin, its purpose, and the life of the man who had hidden it. Finding it had not solved their problems. It had simply replaced them with a single, all-consuming question. What have we found? Finally, Lucas looked up, his eyes wide. I don't know most of these words, he said slowly, his voice hushed with awe. The grammar is old-fashioned. But I can read the headings of the columns. He pointed a trembling finger at the top of the page. This one says, Name der Familie, family name. This one, Betrag, amount. And this one, he paused, leaning closer to the page. This one says, Zielort. It means destination. Elena felt a chill crawl up her arms. Destination. It wasn't just a record of what they owned. It was a record of where they were going. This wasn't a bank ledger. It was something else. A logbook for a journey. A profound and terrible understanding began to dawn in the back of her mind, a horrifying puzzle piece clicking into place. The German script, the names, the time period this was likely from. The mystery deepened, its edges darkening, hinting at a story far more tragic and heroic than she could have ever imagined. The print shop was not just a hiding place. It was a station, a waypoint on a road to survival. Lucas hunched over the ledger, the flashlight beam trembling slightly in his hand. The weak yellow light made the old sepia ink seem to glow against the yellowed paper. The words are formal, he whispered, his voice hushed with a strange reverence. It's not like the German I learned. He pointed a dirt-smudged finger at a recurring word. This one, Aufbewahrung. It means safekeeping or custody. Elena felt her heart begin to beat a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. Safekeeping. The word hung in the cold, damp air, imbued with a sudden, immense weight. She stared at the pile of canvas bags, no longer seeing a treasure, but a collection of trusts. A deep, instinctual fear, colder and more profound than her fear of poverty, began to snake its way around her heart. She wrapped her arms around herself, but the chill was coming from within. This was not a thief's hoard. This was something far more complicated, something sacred. He continued to scan the pages, his brow furrowed in concentration. The silence in the cavernous room was absolute, broken only by the steady, maddening plink, plink, plink of the dripping water and the soft rustle of the ancient paper as Lucas turned a page. Here, he breathed, his voice catching, Reisepass, Ausweis, Papiere. He looked up at her, his eyes wide in the gloom. Passport. Identification card. Papers. The words struck Elena like stones. Passports. Papers. Safekeeping. The German script. The Jewish-sounding names. The list of worldly possessions reduced to gold coins and small bars. A horrifying, unbelievable picture began to assemble itself in her mind, the jagged pieces clicking into place with sickening certainty. She felt a wave of dizziness, her hand instinctively going to the cold iron of the press to steady herself. The air in the room suddenly felt thin, hard to breathe. The story of this gold was not one of greed, but of desperation. The dates confirmed her dawning horror. At the top of each page, Klaus had meticulously noted the year, 1938, 1939, 1941, the years of rising terror, of Kristallnacht, of closing borders and stolen lives. The destinations Lucas had deciphered earlier flashed in her mind. America, England, Brazil. This print shop hadn't just been a business. It had been a station on an underground railroad. The giant, silent machines around her weren't just for printing advertisements. They had printed false identities, forged travel documents, created new lives on paper for people whose own had been declared worthless. A profound awe mingled with the terror in her chest. Klaus, her husband's grandfather, the man he'd never mentioned, had been waging a secret war from this cold, dark room. He had been fighting a monstrous evil, not with a gun, but with ink, paper, and a printing press. The realization was a physical shock, sending a tremor through her entire body. Finally, Lucas found a short, concise entry from 1942. His German was just good enough to piece together the simple, declarative sentences. They say the families were Jewish, he stammered, his voice cracking. Fleeing the Nazis. He looked at his mother, his face pale. His youthful innocence stripped away in an instant. The shop was a front. He forged passports to get them out. The gold, it wasn't payment, Mom. It was their life savings. Everything they had. He was smuggling it out for them, holding it in trust until they were safe, until he could get it to them. The truth, spoken aloud, was devastating. It was a story of impossible heroism, of a quiet, incredible bravery that humbled her to her very soul. The gold on the floor wasn't a prize. It was the condensed hope and future of dozens of families who had escaped the greatest evil in modern history. It was a sacred trust, and they were standing in its sanctuary. A wave of shame so hot it felt like a fever washed over Elena. Her earlier fleeting thought of taking just a few coins, just enough to get by, now felt like a sacrilege. She looked at the gold, and it seemed to pulse with a different light. The light of memory and suffering and survival. She felt the presence of the families in the room with her, the ghosts of the Sterns, the Abramoviches, the Weisses, their silent, trusting eyes upon her. This ledger was not a map to wealth, it was a promise Klaus had made, and one he had died before he could fulfill. She felt an almost unbearable weight settle on her shoulders, the gravity of a history she had stumbled into. They were no longer just trespassers in a ruin. They were guardians, custodians of a legacy of courage that had lain dormant in the dark for half a century. Her own problems, her hunger, her grief, seemed to shrink, dwarfed by the sheer scale of the secret they had unearthed. The air, charged with the ghosts of the past, was suddenly shattered by a sound from the present, a low, powerful rumble from outside. It was not the groan of a passing truck. The sound was smooth, controlled, the purr of a finely tuned, expensive engine. It grew louder, then stopped directly in front of the print shop. Elena's heart seized in her chest. A primitive, animal fear shot through her. She grabbed Lucas by the arm, her fingers digging into his thin jacket, and pulled him back with frantic urgency. "Get back!" she hissed, her voice a choked whisper. "Behind the press. Now!" They scrambled into the deepest shadows behind the Heidelberg, crouching down, their bodies pressed against the cold, greasy iron. Elena held her breath, her ears straining, every nerve ending on fire. The silence that followed the engine cutting off was more terrifying than the noise had been. It was a watchful, predatory silence. Twin beams of brilliant, piercing white light sliced through the grimy plywood of the storefront window, cutting sharp, geometric patterns across the cavernous room. The light caught the millions of dust motes hanging in the air, illuminating them in a swirling, chaotic dance. A car door opened and closed with a solid, satisfying thump that spoke of wealth and precision engineering. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on the gravel and broken asphalt outside. They were unhurried, confident, the sound of someone who believed they owned the ground they walked on. The footsteps stopped at the door. Elena flattened herself further against the press, pulling Lucas so close she could feel the frantic, rabbit-like beat of his heart against her side. Her own heart was a wild drum against her ribs. Who could possibly be here? Who knew they were here? The flimsy tarps they had draped over the secret compartment suddenly seemed transparent, a pathetic, childish attempt at concealment. A sharp, authoritative rap on the swollen wooden door. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was an explosion in the stillness. Eleanor flinched as if struck. "Hello?" a voice called out. It was a man's voice, smooth and cultured, but with an underlying edge of steel. It was a voice accustomed to being obeyed. "I know there's someone in there. I'm not with the police." Elena's blood ran cold. She clamped a hand over Lucas's mouth, though he was already frozen, silent. She willed them both to become invisible, to melt into the shadows. The man knocked again, harder this time, the force of it rattling the door in its frame. There was a pause. Then a faint, chilling sound, the scrape of a key being inserted into the old padlock, the same one she had opened. A loud, metallic clack echoed in the alcove as the lock sprang open. The door groaned, scraping against the floor as it was pushed inward. A tall, sharp silhouette stood framed in the grey daylight, blotting out the world. The man who stepped inside was the complete antithesis of his surroundings. He wore a dark grey, impeccably tailored suit that seemed to repel the dust and grime of the shop. The air around him carried the faint, clean scent of expensive cologne and rich leather, a smell so out of place it was an offence to the senses. His hair was silver and perfectly coiffed, and his eyes, the colour of a pale winter sky, swept the room with an unnerving, analytical gaze. He saw the piles of debris, the leaking ceiling, and then he saw them, two dirty, frightened figures huddled in the shadows. A slow, thin smile spread across his lips, a smile that held no warmth, only a cold, calculating satisfaction. "Mrs. Sanchez, I presume," he said, his voice as smooth as polished stone. "I am Mr. Steiner. My grandfather was Klaus's old business partner. I've been keeping an eye on this place for a very long time." He took a step further inside, his expensive shoes crunching on fallen plaster. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, swept the room once more, taking in every detail of their pathetic makeshift camp. His gaze lingered for a fraction of a second too long on the Heidelberg press, the one draped in dusty tarpaulins, and a flicker of something knowing glinted in their depths. He turned his attention back to Elena, his smile unwavering. "My development firm is acquiring this entire district for a major redevelopment project," he said, his tone deceptively casual. "This old print shop is the last piece of the puzzle. I know its condition is unfortunate, but I'm prepared to make you a generous, all-cash offer to take it off your hands, $75,000. You and your son can sign the papers and walk away from this ruin today." The number hung in the air, a breathtaking, dizzying sum. It was salvation. It was a new house, food, clothes, a future for Lucas. It was an escape from the cold, the hunger, the terror. It was a clean, legitimate way out. Elena's mind reeled, the world tilting on its axis. $75,000. The offer was a powerful sedative, promising to numb all her pain, to solve all her problems. She could take the money and run. They could disappear, start over somewhere new where no one knew them. It was a real, tangible lifeline, offered by a man in a suit, not a fantasy hidden in the belly of a machine. But then she felt it. The hard, rectangular corner of the ledger pressing against her ribs, a silent, unyielding witness. She thought of the names inside. Stern, Weiss, Abramovich. She thought of the families who had handed their entire world over to a brave stranger, trusting him. Her throat went dry. The words of escape died on her lips. She could not betray them. She could not sell their hope for her own comfort. She hesitated, her silence a clear answer to the man who was watching her with unnerving intensity. The polite smile on Steiner's face vanished instantly. The mask of civility disintegrated, revealing the cold, hard predator beneath. His eyes narrowed. "This is not a negotiation, Mrs. Sanchez," he said, his voice dropping, losing its smooth veneer and becoming flat and dangerous. "This is your one and only offer." He took a step closer, his presence suddenly menacing, filling the space between them. "This is a very dangerous building, structurally unsound. The wiring is ancient. It's a tinderbox, really, prone to accidents." He let the final word hang in the air, a poisoned dart. Fires happen in places like this all the time. The threat was no longer abstract. It was specific, and it was aimed directly at them. Eleanor felt a tremor of pure terror run through her. He knew. He didn't know for sure, but he suspected. He was hunting for the gold. He had been hunting for it for years. His cold gaze then flickered, moving from her face down to Lucas, who was pressed against her side, trembling. The shift was deliberate, a calculated move to maximize his leverage, to twist the knife. Steiner's voice dropped to a low, conspiratorial whisper, a sound more terrifying than any shout. "It would be a real tragedy," he murmured, the words dripping with ice, "if something were to happen to your boy in a place like this. A real tragedy. The threat was no longer about the building. It was about her son. It was a cold, sharp blade pressed directly against Lucas's throat, and Steiner was holding the hilt. Elena's breath hitched, a strangled gasp of pure maternal terror. Her protective instincts screamed, a silent, primal roar in her mind. This man would not hesitate. He would burn the building to the ground with them inside to get what he wanted. He was not just a developer, he was a monster. Steiner seemed to sense he had made his point. He straightened his suit jacket, the mask of polite civility sliding partially back into place. He pulled a slim, elegant business card from his pocket and slid it onto a nearby dusty crate, the clean white rectangle a stark slash against the grime. "You have my offer," he said, his voice returning to its businesslike tone. "Call my office with your affirmative response. You have 24 hours. Without another glance at them, he turned and walked out, his confident footsteps echoing in the silence he left behind. The heavy thud of his car door was a sound of absolute finality. Elena was left shaking, her body racked with tremors she couldn't control. The cold of the room was nothing compared to the ice that now flooded her veins, a paralyzing, bone-deep fear for her son's life. She was trapped in an impossible dilemma. She looked at the business card, then at the top hiding the gold, then at her son's terrified face. The choice was a guillotine. On one side, there was $75,000, a guaranteed escape, a new life, her son's safety purchased by betraying a sacred trust. On the other, a fortune that didn't belong to her, a duty to the ghosts of the past, and a direct path into the crosshairs of a ruthless, powerful man who had just threatened to kill her child. The despair of poverty seemed like a simple, clean pain compared to this. This was a choice between her soul and her son. What would you do in her place? Would you take the developer's money, a guaranteed escape from poverty, and turn a blind eye to the secret? Or would you risk your own son's life to protect a treasure that didn't belong to you and honor the ghosts of a history you just discovered? The engine's purr faded into the oppressive silence, leaving a void that was quickly filled by the frantic hammering of Elena's own heart. The clean white business card sat on the dusty crate, an obscene intrusion of a sterile world into their ruin. It was a poison pill disguised as a lifeline. $75,000. The number echoed in her mind, a seductive whisper promising warmth, food, an end to this waking nightmare. But the phantom weight of the gold, hidden just feet away, and the hard edge of the ledger pressed against her ribs, anchored her to a different, more terrifying reality. She stared at the spot where Steiner had stood, half expecting to see the floor scorched by his presence. A cold, clammy sweat broke out across her forehead, and a wave of nausea so profound it made her knees buckle washed over her. Lucas was silent, his small body rigid with a fear that mirrored her own. He was just a boy, and she had led him into the crosshairs of a monster. The guilt was a physical pain, sharp and stabbing, right below her sternum. The minutes after Steiner's departure stretched into an eternity of agonizing silence. The only sounds were the steady, indifferent drip of water and the ragged, shallow breaths she and Lucas shared in their dark corner. The air itself felt heavy, charged with the lingering menace of his cologne and the foul poison of his words. Eleanor felt utterly paralyzed, trapped between an impossible duty and an unspeakable threat. Her mind, usually a fortress of maternal resolve, was a frantic storm of terrifying images, the glint in Steiner's eyes, the casual cruelty in his voice, the chillingly specific threat against Lucas, and then the fire. The thought of it, of flames consuming the old wood and their meager hopes, sent a violent shudder through her body. She wrapped her arms tighter around her son, a futile gesture of protection against a danger that felt as intangible and all-encompassing as the cold, damp air itself. She was no longer just fighting poverty. She was now a player in a deadly game where she didn't know the rules, and the stakes were her son's life. A new sound, faint and hesitant, cut through her spiraling panic. It was not the groan of the wind or the scuttling of a rat. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It came from the front of the shop, a gentle but insistent noise on the main door. Elena froze, her blood turning to ice. Her first thought was that Steiner had returned, that the 24-hour ultimatum was a lie. She held her breath, straining to listen, her body tensed for an explosion of violence, but the sound was wrong. It wasn't the confident, authoritative knock of Steiner. This was tentative, questioning. Lucas looked at her, his eyes wide with terror, a silent question on his lips. She pressed a finger to her own, commanding a silence he was already keeping. The tapping stopped, and for a long moment there was nothing. Then a new sound, the creak of old wood as the door, which Steiner had left unlocked, was pushed slowly, hesitantly open. A sliver of grey daylight cut into the gloom, and a figure, stooped and ancient, stepped cautiously inside. He was a small, thin man, dwarfed by the cavernous space and the monolithic presses. He looked as old as the building itself, his face a road map of wrinkles, his shoulders stooped with the weight of a century. He wore a simple, dark vest over a collarless shirt, and a small, worn leather apron. In his hand, he held a walking stick, which he used not for support, but to gently probe the ground before him as he moved. His eyes, magnified by thick, round glasses, blinked slowly, adjusting to the gloom. They were pale blue eyes, but unlike Steiner's, they were not cold. They were filled with a deep, ancient sadness, the eyes of a man who had seen too much of the world. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, his gaze sweeping the room, not with the acquisitive hunger of Steiner, but with a strange, sorrowful familiarity. He paused, his head cocked as if listening to the ghosts of the past, the scent of old wood, oil, and time clinging to him like a shroud. A profound sense of peace seemed to emanate from him. He saw them then, huddled in the shadows of the great Heidelberg. He did not seem surprised. He gave a small, slow nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, not threat. "The vulture does not sing," he said, his voice a low, raspy whisper, thick with an accent that stretched vowels and softened consonants. "He only circles what he believes is already dead." He took another slow step towards them, his cane tapping softly on the concrete. "I am Abramovich. I have the shop across the street." He gestured vaguely with a gnarled, ink-stained hand. "The clocks. I have been watching this place for 50 years. Waiting." Elena stared at him, her fear momentarily replaced by utter confusion. Abramovich. The name. It was one of the names in the ledger. Her heart gave a painful lurch. She felt the leather-bound book against her ribs, a sudden, burning weight. This old man, this ghost from across the street, was a part of the story. He was not a random stranger. He was a survivor. He was the living history she had just unearthed. Elena felt a strange compulsion to trust him, an instinct that went against every terrified impulse screaming at her to stay hidden. She slowly, shakily, got to her feet, pulling Lucas up with her. She did not speak, her throat tight with 1,000 unasked questions. The old clockmaker's eyes softened as he looked at her, at the dirt on her face, the fear in her eyes, the fierce protective grip she had on her son. "He threatened you," Abramovich stated. It wasn't a question. "Steiner, I saw his car. I have seen that car before. I know the look in his eyes. It is the same look his grandfather had." The words hit Elena with the force of a physical blow. Steiner's grandfather. The business partner. The lie. The pieces began to fall into place, forming a picture of a betrayal that spanned generations. "His grandfather," Abramovich continued, his voice dropping lower, "was no partner to Klaus. He was a melder, an informant. He tasted Jewish gold on his tongue and sold souls to the Gestapo for the promise of more." A wave of cold dread washed over Elena, so intense it made her dizzy. The story in the ledger, the one she had only just begun to piece together, was suddenly darker, more sinister. The threat was not new. It was an old evil, inherited and passed down, and it had been hunting this gold for decades. Abramovich's gaze drifted to the Heidelberg press, to the dusty tarps she and Lucas had so hastily arranged. His eyes, though clouded with age, missed nothing. "Klaus was a good man," he whispered, his voice thick with a grief that was still raw after more than half a century. "A brave man. He built that compartment himself, welded it in the dead of night. He showed it to me when I was a boy, no older than your son. My father gave him our savings, our wedding rings, everything. He said Klaus had the honest eyes of a craftsman, not a thief. He pointed a trembling finger at the ledger, which was a distinct bulge under Elena's coat. My name is in that book. Abramovich, my father, my mother, my sister. We were the lucky ones. We got out. He hobbled closer, his sad eyes fixed on Lucas. Klaus made us new names, new lives on paper. My family became the Beaumonts from Belgium. We sailed to America from Lisbon. Klaus promised he would find us when the war was over, when it was safe to return our future to us. But he died, a sudden heart attack, they said. The secret died with him, and the jackals began to circle. He looked back toward the front of the shop, towards the street, his expression hardening. Steiner's grandfather searched this place after Klaus's death. He tore it apart, but he was a man of brute force. He looked for a safe in the wall, a box under the floorboards. He never thought to look inside the art itself. He never understood the soul of a craftsman. Abramovich looked back at Elena, his gaze sharp and penetrating. For 50 years, I have watched this shop. I have chased away vandals, discouraged buyers. I have guarded this place. It is my penance for surviving, my duty to the others. I have been waiting for someone with Klaus's blood to return. The weight of his words, of his 50-year vigil, settled upon Elena, a heavy cloak of responsibility and shared history. She was no longer alone in this. She had an ally, a guardian who understood the true nature of the treasure she had found. A fragile sense of hope, the first she had felt in days, began to bloom in the barren landscape of her fear. She finally found her voice, though it was a raw, cracked whisper. He gave us 24 hours, she said, the words tasting like poison. He wants the deed. He threatened Lucas. Abramovich nodded slowly, his jaw tight. He has grown impatient. His redevelopment project gives him the legal power to demolish this entire block. This is his last chance to seize the gold before the building. And its secret is turned to dust. He will not wait 24 hours. He is not a man who gives warnings he doesn't intend to act upon. He will come back tonight. Not with papers. With force. The old man's certainty was absolute. Chilling. The fragile hope in Elena's chest was immediately extinguished by a fresh wave of terror. As if summoned by his words, the quiet of the evening was violently shattered. The deep, guttural roar of a heavy truck engine tore through the silence, its sound angry and aggressive. It wasn't the smooth purr of Steiner's luxury car. This was a beast of a machine. Headlights, brighter and higher than a car's, flooded the front of the shop, the powerful beams cutting through the plywood like lasers and throwing stark, terrifying shadows that danced and writhed across the walls. The truck screeched to a halt right outside, the protest of its brakes a shriek in the night. Doors slammed open and shut. Heavy, booted footsteps pounded on the asphalt. There were voices, rough and low, laced with a brutal impatience. Elena's heart stopped. Abramovich was right. The ultimatum was a lie. They were here. Steiner had sent his thugs. Her blood ran cold as she realized they were trapped. There was no escape. The building was their prison, and the executioners were at the door. They were going to die here. Abramovich moved with a sudden, surprising speed. He grabbed Elena's arm, his grip frail but firm. "Not the front door," he hissed, his eyes blazing with a fierce, unexpected fire. "There is a service cellar. The entrance is behind the office. It connects to the old steam tunnels. Klaus showed it to me. In case of emergencies. This is an emergency." He began pulling her towards the back of the shop, his small, stooped frame now a beacon of desperate purpose. But Elena resisted, her feet rooted to the spot. "The gold! The ledger!" she cried, her voice a strangled whisper. "We can't leave them!" She could not, would not, abandon the trust that had been placed in her hands, not even with death hammering at the door. Leaving the gold for Steiner would be a desecration, a final victory for the evil his family represented. It was an insane thought, to risk their lives for a treasure they couldn't keep, but in that split second, she knew it was the only choice she could make. It was about more than survival. It was about justice. A thunderous crash echoed from the front of the building as a heavy crowbar splintered the old wooden door. The sound of destruction was terrifyingly close. "They are in!" Lucas gasped, his voice trembling. The thugs were shouting now, their voices coarse and ugly, echoing in the cavernous space. "Come on out! We know you're in here, lady! Don't make this harder than it has to be!" Another crash, the sound of glass shattering, followed by a cruel laugh. They were enjoying this. Abramovich looked from Eleanor's fiercely determined face to the tarps covering the Heidelberg press, and a look of profound understanding dawned in his ancient eyes. He nodded once. A sharp, decisive movement. "Then we must be quick. Like rats in the dark," he whispered, a plan forming in the heat of the moment. "They will search the office first. It's human nature. We go for the machine. We take what we can. Then we run for the cellar." It was a desperate, suicidal plan, but it was the only one they had. The only other option was to surrender, and that was unthinkable. The main room was cast in a terrifying strobe effect as the thugs' powerful flashlights cut sweeping arcs through the darkness. The beams danced and jumped, illuminating pieces of the nightmare, a rusted gear, a pile of rubble, a thick curtain of cobwebs. The men moved with a brutish confidence, two large, shadowy figures trashing the small office area with systematic violence. The sound of the old desk being splintered apart, of papers being ripped and thrown, was a sickening percussion in the symphony of terror. Crouched behind a different press, closer to the Heidelberg, Elena, Lucas, and Abramovich watched, their hearts pounding in unison. They were waiting for the precise moment, a window of opportunity that might only last a few seconds. The air was thick with the smell of dust, mold, and their own fear. Eleanor held Lucas's hand, his palm sweaty and cold, her own trembling so violently she could barely feel her fingers. Time seemed to stretch and warp, each second an eternity of suspense. "Nothing here," one of the thugs grunted, his voice filled with frustration. "Check the rest of this dump." This was their chance. As the flashlight beam swung away towards the far side of the shop, Abramovich gave Elena a sharp nudge. "Now," he breathed. The three of them moved as one, a frantic, silent scramble across the debris-strewn floor. Their movements were desperate, clumsy in the dark. Elena's foot slipped on a patch of damp concrete, and she nearly cried out, stifling the sound with her hand. Lucas, his face a pale mask of terror, moved with a surprising swiftness, his youthful agility an asset. They reached the Heidelberg press, their shadows dancing like frantic ghosts as the distant flashlight beams swept back and forth. Elena's hands tore at the heavy tarpaulins, her fingers fumbling with the stiff, dusty fabric. The simple act of pulling them aside felt like it was taking an eternity. The seconds stretched, each one a hammer blow against her sanity. The thugs were getting closer. The dark, gaping hole in the side of the machine was revealed. "The ledger," Eleanor whispered, her voice cracking. It was the most important thing. She reached inside her coat, pulled out the leather-bound book, and thrust it into Lucas's hands. "Guard this with your life," she commanded, her voice filled with a desperate intensity he had never heard before. He clutched it to his chest and nodded, his eyes wide. Then came the gold. There was no time to be gentle, no time to count. Abramovich, his face grim, reached into the hollow compartment and began pulling out the heavy canvas bags. He worked with a feverish strength, his old body animated by a primal urgency. Elena joined him, her hands plunging into the darkness, grabbing the heavy, sagging sacks of history and hope. The bags were brutally heavy, an anchor threatening to drag them down, but they were also their only weapon. Each one was a testament against Steiner, a piece of irrefutable evidence. They had to take it all. They could not leave a single coin behind for the jackals. They managed to pull out 5 bags, far less than the full dozen, but all they could possibly carry. The weight was immense, almost unmanageable. "It's too much. We have to go," Abramovich hissed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Just then, a beam of light fell upon them. "Hey, what the hell is that?" one of the thugs yelled from across the room. The game was up. They had been seen. The flashlight beam pinned them against the side of the press like terrified insects. For a heart-stopping second, everyone was frozen. The thug stared, his mind slowly processing the impossible scene. A terrified woman, a boy, and an old man pulling heavy sacks from a secret compartment in an ancient machine. Then his eyes narrowed with greedy realization. "Boss is gonna want to see this," he snarled, and started towards them, raising his crowbar. The moment of stillness was broken. Adrenaline, pure and potent, surged through Eleanor's veins. She grabbed 2 of the bags. "Run!" she screamed, the word torn from her throat. They didn't run towards the exit. They ran deeper into the ruin, following Abramovich's lead. The thugs, momentarily stunned by their bizarre discovery, hesitated for a crucial second before giving chase, their heavy boots pounding on the concrete behind them. The chase was a blind, stumbling nightmare through a labyrinth of iron and shadows. Elena's arms screamed from the weight of the bags, the rough canvas scraping her skin raw. Each step was a jarring, painful impact. Lucas was just ahead of her, clutching the ledger, his breath coming in choked sobs. Abramovich, surprisingly agile, led them through the maze, his mind a map of the place he had guarded for a lifetime. "This way, behind the main paper press," he wheezed, pointing with his cane. They ducked behind another hulking machine as a crowbar, thrown with vicious force, clanged against the iron frame where Eleanor's head had been just a moment before. The sound was deafening, a sharp crack of metal that vibrated through her bones. She could feel the hot breath of their pursuers. They reached the back wall, the spot where the small, crumbling office stood. "Here," Abramovich grunted, pointing his cane at a section of the floor that looked no different from the rest. He kicked aside a pile of sodden cardboard to reveal a heavy iron ring, set flush into the concrete. It was the entrance to the cellar. He bent down, his old hands fumbling with the ring, his knuckles white with strain. "Help me," he gasped. Elena dropped the bags with a heavy thud and knelt beside him, her fingers clawing at the cold, rusted iron. The footsteps were getting closer, the flashlight beams cutting wildly through the darkness, bouncing off the walls. "Found you, you little rats!" one of the thugs bellowed, his voice echoing with triumphant cruelty. Elena and Abramovich pulled with all their remaining strength. The heavy concrete slab covering the entrance was sealed by decades of damp and neglect. For a terrible moment, nothing happened. The slab was fused to the floor. They were trapped. Their last desperate hope was gone. Then, with a deep, grating groan of stone on stone, the slab shifted. It moved only an inch, but it was enough. A sliver of blackness, colder and more absolute than the darkness of the shop, appeared. A faint smell of damp earth and tunnels, the smell of escape, wafted up. Lucas, seeing them struggle, wedged the end of the discarded crowbar into the opening. Using the mechanical advantage, he threw his slight weight against it. The slab lifted, scraping loudly as it tilted upwards, revealing a dark, square hole in the floor and a set of steep stone steps leading down into the abyss. "Go! Go now!" Abramovich yelled, pushing Lucas towards the opening. Lucas hesitated for only a second, his eyes on his mother, before scrambling down into the darkness. The precious ledger still clutched to his chest. Elena grabbed the bags of gold, her muscles screaming in protest, and began shoving them into the hole, the heavy sacks thudding onto the steps below. The thugs were almost upon them, their heavy shapes looming out of the darkness. Elena shoved the last bag into the opening and turned to Abramovich. "You next!" she yelled, but the old man shook his head, a grim, determined look on his ancient face. He stood at the edge of the opening, his frail body a pathetic but defiant barrier. "They are too close," he said, his voice calm amidst the chaos. "They will follow you. I will buy you time." He raised his simple wooden walking stick as one of the thugs, a mountain of a man, lunged at him. For a moment, Elena was paralyzed by his insane bravery, by the sacrifice he was willing to make. This man, who had survived the Nazis, was now facing down 2 brutes in a dark, forgotten factory to protect her, her son, and the memory of his people. The sight of his quiet courage broke through her fear. She could not let him do this. She could not let his story end here, a forgotten martyr in a dusty ruin. This was not a sacrifice she was willing to accept. The time for running was over. She was not a victim. She was a guardian. The first thug reached the opening, a cruel, triumphant grin on his face. He looked down at the old man, dismissing him as a minor obstacle, his eyes fixed on the dark hole leading to the gold. "End of the line, Grandpa," he sneered, raising his crowbar for a final. Brutal blow. In that split second, Elena acted. Fueled by a potent cocktail of terror and rage, she grabbed the heaviest thing she could find, a solid iron gear from a disassembled machine part lying in the debris. It was heavy, greasy, and it filled her hand with a satisfying, brutal weight. She swung it with all her might, a single, fluid motion powered by every ounce of her maternal fury. She wasn't aiming to disable him. She was aiming to stop him. The gear connected with the side of the thug's knee with a sickening, wet crunch that was audible even over their own ragged breathing. He let out a high-pitched scream of agony and surprise, his leg buckling beneath him as he crumpled to the floor, clutching his shattered knee. The second thug stopped short, his eyes wide with shock at the sudden, violent turn of events. He stared at his partner writhing on the floor, then at Elena, who stood panting. The heavy gear still clutched in her hand, her eyes blazing with a ferocity he had not anticipated. He saw not a frightened victim, but a cornered animal, a mother wolf protecting her cubs, capable of anything. His confidence wavered. This wasn't the easy job he'd been promised. Abramovich seized the opportunity. He slammed the heavy concrete slab back down with a deafening boom that shook the floor and sealed the cellar entrance. The sound was a punctuation mark, a declaration of intent. Then he looked at the remaining thug, who was hesitating, caught between his greed and his newfound fear. "She will not be the only one who fights," the old man said, his voice ringing with a sudden, surprising authority. "This place has ghosts, and they are all on her side." The thug looked from Eleanor's wild eyes to the old man's chilling calm, and for the first time he looked afraid. But before he could decide whether to fight or flee, a new sound cut through the tense standoff. It was the high-pitched, piercing shriek of multiple police sirens converging on their location from all directions. The sound grew louder, closer, an undeniable wave of approaching authority. The thug's face went pale. His eyes darted towards the front of the building, then back at Elena, his mind racing. This was a trap. They had walked right into a trap. Panic, overriding all other instincts. He turned and fled, half carrying, half dragging his whimpering, injured partner towards a back exit, desperate to escape the closing net. The sirens grew to a deafening crescendo, and the building was suddenly bathed in flashing red and blue lights, the strobing colors pouring through the shattered windows and painting the cavernous room in a chaotic, surreal light. Elena finally let the heavy gear fall from her hand, the clang of iron on concrete lost in the rising wail of the sirens. It was over. She sank to her knees, her body trembling uncontrollably, the adrenaline leaving her weak and nauseous. A moment later, the door was kicked open again, but this time by men in tactical uniforms, shouting, "Police, show me your hands!" Elena and Abramovich slowly raised their hands, their faces illuminated by the blinding beams of tactical flashlights. The chaos was overwhelming, the room swarming with armed officers. From the back of the crowd, a calm, authoritative figure stepped forward. He was a sharply dressed man in a suit, but his eyes were kind and intelligent. He took in the scene, the trembling woman, the ancient clockmaker, the ransacked office, the evidence of a violent struggle. He knelt in front of Elena, his voice calm and reassuring. "Ma'am, I'm Special Agent Miller, Federal Art Crime Unit. We received a call about historical assets at this address. Are you Elena Sanchez?" Elena could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. The world was spinning, the flashing lights and shouting voices fading into a distant roar. She had done it. She had protected the secret. She had honored the trust. Suddenly, she remembered Lucas. "My son," she gasped, a fresh wave of panic gripping her. "He's in the cellar." She pointed a trembling finger at the heavy stone slab on the floor. Two officers immediately moved to lift it. As the slab was pulled away, Lucas's small, terrified face appeared in the opening, his eyes blinking in the brilliant, flashing lights. He was still clutching the ledger to his chest like a shield. He saw his mother, safe, surrounded by police, and a look of profound relief washed over his face. He scrambled out of the hole and ran to her, throwing his arms around her neck. Elena hugged him with a desperate, crushing force, burying her face in his hair, inhaling the scent of him, reassuring herself that he was real, that he was safe. Tears of relief, grief, and sheer, overwhelming exhaustion finally came, streaming down her face in hot, silent rivers. They had survived. They had actually survived. The weight of the world, which she had been carrying on her shoulders, finally began to lift. Abramovich stood watching them, a small, tired smile on his lips. He walked over to Agent Miller and spoke in a low, quiet voice, gesturing with his cane towards the other bags of gold still hidden inside the Heidelberg press. The agent listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each word the old man spoke. He looked at the ledger in Lucas's arms, then back at the press, and understanding dawned on his face. He gave a series of quiet, efficient orders to his team. The print shop, which had been a tomb of secrets for over 50 years, was now an active crime scene, a place of historical revelation. The story of Klaus and his secret war, of the families he saved, of the treasure he guarded, was finally, after all these years, coming into the light. Elena, holding her son, watched as the wheels of justice, slow but inexorable, began to turn. She had stumbled into this story as a desperate victim, but she was emerging from it as something else entirely. She was a witness, a guardian, a link in a chain of courage that stretched back through the darkest chapter of history. Agent Miller approached her again, his voice gentle. "Mrs. Sanchez," he said, "Mr. Abramovich has told me everything. You have been incredibly brave. What you have protected here, it's more than just gold. It's history. It's justice. Long overdue." He looked at the exhausted but resolute expression on her face, and a hint of a respectful smile touched his lips. "It seems we have a lot to talk about." Elena looked from the agent's kind face to the stoic, proud figure of Mr. Abramovich, and then down at her son, who was looking up at her with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. In his eyes, she was no longer just his mother. She was a hero. A profound warmth spread through her chest, chasing away the last of the bone-deep chill. She had faced down the monster and won. She had not only saved her son, she had saved the souls in the ledger. Her small, desperate story of survival had become a testament to the enduring power of hope and the quiet courage of ordinary people caught in extraordinary times. The two thugs were apprehended less than a mile away, their escape thwarted by the perimeter the police had established. Their capture was a small, satisfying footnote to the larger events of the night. As the crime scene team worked meticulously, documenting and recovering the remaining bags of gold from the Heidelberg press, Elena, Lucas, and Abramovich were escorted out of the building. The cool night air felt shockingly fresh and clean after the stale, metallic air of the shop. Elena took a deep breath, filling her lungs, and it felt like the first real breath she had taken in days. The street was a chaotic circus of police cars, official vehicles, and flashing lights. The entire forgotten industrial zone had been awakened, brought to life by the story that had been sleeping in its heart. Elena felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching a movie about someone else's life. It was all too much, too fast, too overwhelming to process. She was just a seamstress. How had she ended up here? They were led to a warm, waiting car. An officer gently placed a thick, soft blanket around Elena's shoulders. The simple act of kindness, the warmth of the wool, was so unexpected, so comforting, that it nearly made her break down again. Lucas climbed in beside her, his body finally relaxing its tense, fearful posture. He leaned his head against her shoulder, and within moments, the adrenaline crash claimed him, and he was fast asleep. Abramovich was helped into the front seat. He looked over his shoulder at her, his ancient eyes twinkling in the flashing lights. "Klaus would be proud of you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You have his courage." The compliment, coming from this man who had guarded the secret for a lifetime, was a gift more precious than all the gold in the world. Elena felt a profound connection to the grandfather-in-law she had never known, a sense of having fulfilled a duty she never knew she had. She was a part of his story now, forever intertwined with his legacy. As the car pulled away, Elena looked back at the print shop one last time. It was no longer a place of despair and ruin. It was lit up, swarming with people, a hive of activity. It was a place where a great wrong was finally being set right. The flashing lights illuminated the faded, ghostly letters of its name, Klaus's Print Shop. For the first time, the name held a warmth, a sense of pride. It was not a tomb, it was a monument to bravery, to resistance, to the enduring power of a single righteous promise. The car drove on, leaving the chaos behind, moving towards the dawn of a new day. Elena held her sleeping son, the weight of him a comforting, solid presence. The terror had passed. The climax was over. She did not know what the future held, what would become of the gold or of them. But for the first time in a very long time, as the first grey light of morning began to streak the sky, Elena Sanchez felt a flicker of something she had thought was lost to her forever. She felt hope. In the sterile, quiet calm of a federal building conference room, the world stopped spinning. The air, tasting of freshly brewed coffee and floor wax, was a universe away from the metallic tang of decay that had filled Elena's lungs for what felt like a lifetime. The chair beneath her was solid and supportive, a stark contrast to the damp, splintering crate that had been her last seat of contemplation. Agent Miller spoke in low, reassuring tones, his voice a steady anchor in the sea of her exhaustion. On the polished mahogany table, the ledger lay open, treated with the reverence of a holy relic. Experts in white gloves turned its pages under bright, respectful lights. For the first time since the cold click of her apartment lock, Eleanor felt the suffocating weight on her chest begin to lift. A profound, bone-deep sense of safety washed over her, a sensation so foreign and so welcome that tears welled in her eyes. She wasn't a trespasser or a victim anymore. She was a witness, and she was finally safe. Abramovich's single, crucial phone call had not been to a generic police dispatcher. It had been to a private number he had guarded for decades, a direct line to a senior director at the Heritage Reclamation Project, a global Jewish foundation specializing in the recovery of Holocaust-era assets. Within minutes, a legal firestorm had been unleashed. The foundation's lawyers, experts in international law and historical claims, immediately engaged with Agent Miller's art crime unit, providing the context and historical precedent needed for a federal warrant. The ledger was their Rosetta Stone. Scans of its pages were emailed to historians in Tel Aviv and Berlin, who worked through the night, cross-referencing names and dates with survivor databases and transport manifests. Klaus's meticulous record-keeping, his neat German script, became an irrefutable weapon of justice, transforming a desperate story of survival into a rock-solid legal case that spanned 3/4 of a century and 2 continents. Mr. Steiner was arrested at dawn, not in a squalid ruin, but in the sterile, minimalist expanse of his penthouse apartment overlooking the city. Federal agents, moving with quiet, implacable efficiency, entered his home just as he was pouring his first espresso. There was no struggle, only a moment of pure, uncomprehending shock on his face as his world of polished concrete and panoramic views was invaded by the grim reality he had tried to control. The mask of predatory confidence shattered, revealing a man suddenly rendered small and powerless. As the cold steel of handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the charges were read aloud: extortion, conspiracy to commit robbery, and, most damningly, the opening of a federal investigation into his family's historical complicity in the confiscation of assets from persecuted peoples during the Second World War. His empire, built on a foundation of generational evil, began to crumble before the sun had fully risen. Back at the federal building, the gold was being accounted for. In a secure room, under the watchful eyes of armed guards, numismatists and metallurgists in lab coats carefully catalogued the treasure. Each coin and hand-cast bar was weighed, photographed, and its provenance analyzed. The soft, musical clinking of the gold, once a sound of terror and temptation for Elena, now sounded like justice. It was the sound of a story being pieced back together, of a historical record being corrected. She watched through a thick pane of glass. Lucas at her side, not with a sense of loss, but with an overwhelming feeling of peace. The immense, crushing burden of the gold was no longer hers to bear. It had passed into the hands of those who could finally fulfill its purpose. Her sacred duty, stumbled upon in the dark, was complete. A quiet sense of rightness settled in her soul, a feeling she had thought was lost to her forever, buried with her husband. Late that afternoon, Agent Miller and a kind-eyed lawyer from the foundation sat down with Elena and Abramovich. They explained that the entirety of the gold would be used to establish a new trust, officially named the Klaus Abramovich Heritage Fund, to trace the descendants named in the ledger. Then the lawyer slid a document across the table. "For your courage, Mrs. Sanchez," she said gently, "and for your integrity in protecting these assets at great personal risk, the law provides for a finder's fee. The board has unanimously voted to award you 15% of the total appraised value." The number, she then stated, was staggering, an impossible figure that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. It was a fortune beyond her wildest dreams, earned not by greed, but by an act of moral defiance. Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time in an age, they were tears of overwhelming, unbelievable joy. She had not only honored the dead, she had secured a future for the living. 6 months later, the world was a different color. Elena sat not on a cold bus stop bench, but on a plush sofa in a living room bathed in the golden light of a late afternoon sun. The air smelled of fresh paint and lemon polish, a scent of new beginnings. In her lap were not the last of her dollars, but the architectural plans for the old print shop. With a portion of her reward and the full blessing of the foundation, she had acquired the building. It would not be demolished. It would be reborn as a community arts center and a small permanent museum dedicated to Klaus's quiet heroism. Lucas walked in, carrying a stack of college brochures. The slump in his shoulders was gone, replaced by the confident posture of a young man with a future. He was laughing, talking about a scholarship he was applying for. The gnawing ache of hunger in Eleanor's memory felt like a story from another lifetime, a ghost that could no longer touch them in the warmth and light of this new home. In a sunlit corner of the room, her old sewing machine sat on a beautiful new oak table, its metal body gleaming. It had been professionally cleaned and oiled, its familiar shape a bridge between her old life and her new one. She ran a hand over its smooth surface, no longer an instrument of desperate, frantic survival. It was now a tool of creation and peace. On the table beside it lay the beginnings of an intricate quilt, a vibrant tapestry of new, rich fabrics. The act of sewing had been transformed. It was no longer about patching holes and staving off poverty. It was about weaving together the threads of her new life, an expression of gratitude and hope. When she sat down to work, the rhythmic hum of the machine was a peaceful mantra, a soothing sound that completely erased the memory of the maddening, rhythmic drip of water in the cold, dark ruin that had, paradoxically, been their salvation. The scent of roasted chicken and rosemary filled a warm, bright kitchen. The table was set for 3. Elena, her face relaxed and happy, moved with an easy grace between the stove and the table. Lucas was setting out glasses, and in the adjoining living room, their guest of honor, Mr. Abramovich, was teaching him a complex chess opening. The old clockmaker was a changed man. The weight of his 50-year vigil had lifted, replaced by the lightness of shared joy and a new sense of family. He had become a grandfather to Lucas, a treasured friend to Elena. As she brought the golden-brown chicken to the table, the image of herself huddled in the dark, her stomach twisted with hunger, felt like a scene from a forgotten black-and-white film. Tonight, they were celebrating. They were feasting not just on food, but on life, on justice, and on the quiet resilience of the human heart. The ghosts of the past were there too, but they were no longer sorrowful. They were honored guests at a table of abundance. The story of Klaus's print shop rippled outwards, far beyond the forgotten industrial zone. The Klaus Abramovich Heritage Fund, featured in international news, became a symbol of hope and belated justice. Within a year, it successfully located the descendants of over a dozen families from the ledger, delivering not just their ancestral fortunes, but the incredible story of their survival and the quiet hero who had made it possible. Steiner's development empire, built on a legacy of greed and blood money, collapsed under the weight of federal investigations and public scandal, his name becoming a modern byword for inherited evil. The print shop itself, beautifully restored, became the heart of a revitalized historic district, a beacon of culture and remembrance. Elena's single, desperate choice, made in the darkest moment of her life, had echoed through time, honoring the past and reshaping the future for countless people she would never even meet. Elena stood on the sidewalk, the setting sun casting a warm glow on her face. Beside her, Abramovich leaned contently on his cane, while Lucas draped a confident arm around her shoulder. Before them stood the renovated print shop, its brick facade clean and welcoming, a small, dignified bronze plaque by the door telling the story of Klaus, the printer who fought an empire with ink and courage. She was no longer the broken, haunted woman from the bus stop. She was strong, her eyes filled with a quiet peace and a profound sense of purpose. Her journey from the brink of oblivion was a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest treasures are not made of gold, but of integrity. Elena had learned that being rich had nothing to do with what you owned. It was about the promises you were willing to keep. If her story of resilience, courage, and ultimate redemption has moved you, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss another tale of the human spirit's incredible triumph over darkness.